Osama bin Laden is and will probably forever be one of the biggest names in DAWAH. The Quran is a scientific miracle. It absolutely has to come from God because it contains information that corresponds to what we know today as scientists, but they wouldn't have known that back then, and certainly not Muhammad. This is what you will hear over and over and over again from different DAWAH groups across the Western world. They make these claims because they are in desperate need of establishing something that others can latch onto, particularly young people, young Muslims who they've heard lots of damaging stories about their deen, and they're looking for something they can latch onto to validate their belief, to give them that extra imam that lets them know it's okay. You don't need to worry, the Quran definitely is true, this is the correct religion, don't worry about it, don't think about it anymore. So today begins the story of how this all began, and it goes back to some interesting characters. Our story starts with a man by the name of Sheikh Abdul Majid Zindani. Dr. Zindani was someone who was known as an Islamicist, who was known for his active political roles in Yemen, was known for his efforts to give dawah by collecting large groups of Western scientists and, in effect, bribing them to come and say nice things about the Quran. He was also known for being the spiritual guide, legal advisor, and just all-round good friend to Osama bin Laden. As you can imagine, this pothole goes very, very deep, and you can still find it today in many textbooks, many websites all over the place on the internet that quote from Dr. Zindani and his good friend Osama bin Laden, and tries to continue this narrative that the Quran is a scientific miracle, that there is only correct things in the Quran, there's only truth. None of it is fabricated, none of it is false, none of it can easily be explained in alternative ways. It has to be spot-on revelation. This narrative has holes in it. Let's investigate. So how did Dr. Zindani do this? How did he get these Western scientists, these academics, these professionals in their field to come meet him and to say things on record about the Quran that would give the Quran some kind of credibility in the scientific world? Well, he had his ways. So some of his ways included arranging for first-class flights, for top-rate hotel accommodation costing thousands, for banquets, for nice meals, the opportunity to meet other academics, all in return for nothing more than just a quick interview to talk about their expertise and how that might relate to Islam in a little way. As you can imagine, what this really amounted to was these scientists being taken advantage of being, in effect, softly bribed to go to meet Dr. Zindani, give him the little sound bites that they needed, and in return, their wives would have a really nice time, get to meet some people, and enjoy general Saudi Arabia. We have some quotes here from some of these scientists that explain exactly what it was like. Professor Gerald Goeringer, an embryologist who is now retired from Georgetown University, said it was mutual manipulation. We got to go places we wouldn't otherwise go. They wanted to add some respectability to what they were publishing. In other words, you pay for our hotel, you pay for the first class flight, you pay for the nice meals, we say something good about the Quran. Professor William Hay, a geologist whom had Methodist parents, he actually came out making a statement against what Dr. Zindani was doing as well. Let's hear what he says.
A Quran which has got claims for scientific miracles in, and you're listed in the back, and it says for that part, and when he was asked about the source of the Quran, he replied, well, I would think it must be the divine being. So are you saying that that is a misrepresentation?
That's a misrepresentation.
Okay.
There's no question about that.
So that's yet another case of a respected Western scientist realizing they were being duped into giving false information that they could then quote mine for their own dawah purposes. According to the Wall Street Journal, someone called Dr. Ahmed, who was working for Dr. Zindani at the time, gave the following statement. He says he reassured the scientists that the commission was completely neutral and welcomed information contradicting the Quran. The scientists soon learned differently. Each one was given a verse from the Quran to examine in light of his expertise. Then Mr. Zindani would interview him on videotape, pushing him to concede divine inspiration. Marine scientist William Hay, then at the University of Colorado, was assigned a passage likening the minds of unbelievers to the darkness in a deep sea, covered by waves, above which are waves. As the videotape rolled, Mr. Zindani pressed Professor Hay to admit that Muhammad couldn't have known about the internal waves caused by varying densities and ocean depths. When Professor Hay suggested Muhammad could have learnt about the phenomenon from sailors, Mr. Zindani insisted that the Prophet never visited a seaport. Professor Hay, a Methodist, says he then raised other hypotheses that Mr. Zindani also dismissed. Finally, Professor Hay conceded that the inspiration for the reference to internal waves must be the divine being, a statement now trumpeted on Islamic websites. Clearly there was some sort of coercion going on here. Dr. Zindani was not playing ball. He wanted to get that quote. He wanted them to say what he needed them to say for his dawah, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. When he did get it, these things will be parroted on every Islamic website and every dawah team up till today. You can still find these people mentioned on dawah websites. You can still find their words taken out of context, used for their own purposes, even when these people actually now reject saying those things and don't agree with what they said and would welcome the opportunity to elaborate. But unfortunately, that's not what Dr. Zindani was hoping for. He wanted his own narrative, and he wanted the best things he could get for giving the Quran some kind of established credibility. According to the Wall Street Journal, they say the following. The commission drew from scientists to its conferences with first-class plane tickets for them and their wives, rooms at the best hotels, £1,000 honoraria, and banquets with Muslim leaders, such as a palace diner in Islamabad with Pakistani President Mohammed Zia-ul-Haq, shortly before he was killed in a plane crash. Mr. Ahmed also gave at least one scientist a crystal clock. One of the Western academics that got suckered into Dr. Zindani's little scheme was someone called Professor Keith Moore. Professor Keith Moore was a lecturer at the University of Toronto who taught clinical anatomy. He was suckered into this plan and ultimately actually produced a book that was a Islamic version of his own book, The Developing Human. It was called The Developing Human with Islamic additions. This book was merely just a copy of his original book, The Developing Human, but this time with additional Islamic-friendly comments that he would use to give the impression that Islam had already got this all understood 1,400 years prior. Evidently that's not true. And evidently this man was being used, but nonetheless, it was something that seemed beneficial to Dr. Keith Moore at the time. It's worth pointing out that Professor Keith Moore has not converted to Islam. In fact, none of these people that I've quoted so far have converted to Islam. They've all stayed exactly where they were, many of them being Christians, many of them not having an affiliated religion. It's worth asking yourself, if they truly believe this, if they truly believe that they actually had found some kind of divine evidence in the Quran, why did they not convert to Islam? Obviously, it's because they never really believed it. Dr. Keith Moore was asked by the Wall Street Journal to give a comment about Dr. Zindani, to which he said, "It's been 10 or 11 years since I was last involved in the Quran." Evidently, Dr. Keith Moore wants to put that behind him and no longer wishes to be involved in these kind of dawah activities. That, however, doesn't stop dawah websites still publishing their quotes, still quote mining, still delivering these pieces of information out of context to give the impression that Western academics actually believe the Quran is divinely inspired. They don't. None of them do. This is all just a ploy from Dr. Zindani and his dawah groups that was started at some point in the 80s and has progressed throughout and still remains today. Let's take a look at Professor Keith Moore's book, The Developing Human, with Islamic additions. So we can see that he has an acknowledgements page where he goes through all the people he would like to thank to help him write and research the book. So let's go through some of these. So we can see some nice names here. Sheikh Mohammed Al-Ajin, Sheikh Osama bin Laden, Wait, what? A Sheikh Osama bin Laden. That's right. Osama bin Laden was a benefactor for the dawah groups that Dr. Zindani had set up. He was not just a financial contributor, he was someone who had a keen interest in Dr. Zindani's work and was close friends with Dr. Zindani, having been described by others as a legal advisor, a spiritual advisor, and a good friend to Dr. Zindani. Osama bin Laden was mentioned as an acknowledgement in the Developing Human with Islamic Additions book. Everything that Dr. Zindani did regarding his dawah, regarding his organizational work, his interactions with Western academics, had the backing and support from Osama bin Laden. Now, it's clear that this couldn't have happened naturally. Western scholars, particularly those who specialize in science, have never seen the Quran as a scientific textbook, have never seen it as being divinely inspired, but rather as simply just a book that's more in line with fiction than non-fiction. The only way that dawah gangs can get around this to avoid all of the scientific blunders in the Quran regarding where the sun sets, regarding sperm coming from the backbone and the ribs, is to simply pay people and to bribe them into saying things for their own causes. And even then, they had to do it with the backing of Osama bin Laden. How is Dr. Zindani and Osama bin Laden, how is their dawah work used today? Well, you can take a look at Dr. Shabir Ali. He still has videos on YouTube where he actually mentions and references and uses and promotes this Developing Human with Islamic Editions book by Dr. Keith Moore. These things are still being used, still being referenced, and still being handed out to everyone they possibly can as a desperate last means of defending Islam. If Dr. Shabir Ali is content and still using these books, is this an endorsement of Dr. Zindani and his work? Is it an endorsement of Dr. Zindani and his supporters, namely Sheikh Osama bin Laden? One would hope not. And hopefully Dr. Shabir Ali comes out and removes his videos and apologizes for ever making them. Keep this in mind whenever you hear anyone tell you that the Quran is a scientific textbook or it's a scientific miracle. Remember the efforts that these people had to go to quote mine these quotes. So whenever you hear someone say, hey, look at this scientist, look what they said about the Quran, be very suspicious about where they got that from and what the circumstances were for them giving that quote. It was often coerced, it was often mutual understanding of material goods, let's put it that way. It wasn't sincere, it was just some guy paying for his hotel, paying for his travel and his food for him and his wife. It was a nice holiday to Saudi Arabia, that's all it was. On the contrast, we can look at how Christianity handles this. Though many of the academics we have are Christians, who are those who specialize in the scientific fields, as well as in philosophy, as well as in many other fields. And we don't have this kind of contention. We've always been open about our faith and never had to have this understanding that actually the Bible is just a one-to-one literal textbook. I'm not going to bribe you by paying for your first class ticket. I'm not going to buy you a nice hotel. I'm not going to give you a nice crystal clock, crystal ball, whatever it might have been. I'm not going to give you any of that. I'm just going to tell you the truth as it is. You are loved eternally by the one true God. There is nothing more I could offer you that's any better or any precious or any more valuable than that. Come to Jesus. Have a good day. God bless.